folks. This afternoon what I want to try and cover is sward adaptation and farm resilience, and to some extent is trying to respond to some of those challenging predictions that Tara was outlined in terms of changes to the weather patterns, changes to where we're going to get more or less growth as the years go forward. But just to zoom out for a second, in terms of the consequences for our grassland, implications of climate change and adaptation, it's a global issue. Okay, this is a worldwide topic of concern in terms of grasslands right around the world, in terms of their sustainability, their restoration, and the challenges that we have to face in terms of adaptation. Coming closer to home, Jerry has written in the journal just quite recently where he examined all of the trends in the south of Ireland in terms of historic grass growth, and we were dealing with some of those same topics and challenges at our AFBI Open Days back in June. So what I want to try and do is address the future challenges, as Tara was saying there, through a number of management and sward adaptations. I'll just touch on fertiliser briefly, and because Tara was well covered that, and then get into some of the nitty-gritty of the sward adaptations. That graph just in the centre bottom of the slide is quite important. It's only a stylised graph, but it's trying to illustrate. You've seen way too many graphs today, by the way, already, but I'll give you some more. The dark green line there shows the peaks and troughs of our grass growth. And in essence, what I'm trying to portray today is a number of steps, science-based, practical measures that you can adopt to try and even out that herbage supply curve throughout the growing season and deal with some of the challenges outlined over the next 100 years, perhaps. So first of all, when we talk about fertiliser, can fertiliser nitrogen modify the shape of that grass curve? And let's face it, for the last number of decades, it has been the go-to option, trying to create that genuine surplus for silage in the spring, early summer, and then try to moderate the grass supply curve for the rest of the growing season. And you can see there, I'm trying to use as much GrassCheck data as possible in the talk today. So we have the three sets of plots in our grass-only trial back at Hillsborough, and you can see there's the 0 nitrogen with grass, the 135 and the 270, and on the face of it you can see a good, healthy, stepwise response to fertiliser right throughout the growing season. However, when you notice there in March and April, and again to some extent in the September into October period, there's relatively little separation of the lines. So there's little that fertiliser can maybe do at those tail ends of the season, and for all sorts of other reasons as well. In terms of the total annual production, you can see there that again the stepwise response from about 4 tonnes with no fertiliser, and that figure's the same all over Ireland, right up to grass plus 270 giving about 9.5 tonnes over the season. So nitrogen fertiliser will be part of the story and will still be there and is part of the adaptation measure. But then, when we look back, even over the last 3 years, 24, 23, 22, all in recent memory in terms of the weather pattern, you can see there was only 1 year, 2022, where we had a reasonably good response to fertiliser on grass swards in that crucial April-May period for growing silage. The last 2 years, 23 and 24, very average responses, and then 22 again, in the latter part of the summer, suboptimal performance. And all of these have received all the same rate of fertiliser over the last 3 years. So weather is still the overriding factor. So in terms of a sward adaptation measure, it's been said before already, I think we do need more agile fertiliser management practices, and some of you do that already, just automatically. But we need to think about the rates, the timings, maybe the types of fertiliser, and the seasonal flexibility in which we apply those. Tara has already said that he's considering building and adjusting the model so that not only will you see in GrassCheck in years to come, you not only see your growth rate prediction for 7 and 14 days, but alongside that, there could be some sort of a traffic light system maybe, or a risk and reward type measure Can you safely apply fertilizer in the next 7 days? And here's the typical response that you'd expect to get. So that's the kind of level of precision that we need to get to with fertilizer. And in some ways you might be thinking, why haven't we developed this before? Why hasn't the industry stepped in and done this before? But it's not there at the moment. So fertilizer will be part of the story, and it will be an adaptation measure. But let's now zone in on the swards themselves. There's 3 steps to this. I want to re-look at some of our grasses, look at other species, lots of mentions of multi-species already today, and finally a controversial one, looking at how we can integrate our grassland, possibly with trees. So first of all, looking at grasses. Tara was telling us that in the years to come, there will be more grass growth potential in April. The likelihood is. Have we got the right grasses in place to make use of that extra growth potential? Not talking about utilising just yet. Can we actually grow grass? In Jerry's article in the journal, he pointed out that, we all know this, grass in that late winter, early springtime is the hardest time to grow grass. It's the lean period. So I took a look back at the ryegrass family. I wanted to look at all sorts of other species. We haven't time. So take a look at the chart. Hybrid ryegrasses over the last 4 years. And those 4 years have been quite variable in terms of weather production. This is the growth that occurs from the last cut in October right the way through to mid-April. So it's the winter, early spring production. Hybrid ryegrasses, top of the page. You see there that the hybrids can do just over 2 tons dry matter production by mid-April. The Italian ryegrasses, about 2.5 tons. Your standard type of grass that you have in your grass mixtures, intermediates and lates on the bottom 2 rows, barely a ton. So, have we got the right grasses to grow grass in that lean period of the year? I'll leave that question. And second of all, annual production. Now these are plots. And as Sinclair said earlier, you can step these numbers down as you take it out to farm and put it into practice. But the total annual production there as well is quite astounding as well. 17, 18 tons, double what you'll get off your perennials. Is it an adaptation measure? I think yes, for that particular time of year. Should we be having more of those types of swards in our farm? Not right across the farm, in particular areas perhaps. Some cautionary notes, the hybrids will persist maybe 4 to 5 years. In some ways that matches in quite well with those of you who are interested in putting red clover into silage swards, because that's about the same level of persistency. And there's other species there which will also bring complementary growth and deeper rooting as well. But we haven't time today. Moving on. Legumes and herbs. Maybe there's other species as well that we can bring into the equation. Again, think back to that very first slide. How can we modify that grass growth curve, or herbage supply curve, maybe we should be calling it. What can grass white clover deliver? You can see that this is just the 2024 production of our grass white clover plots. Sown in 22, they had a part year of measurement in 23, and this is the 2024 year. So you can see at a glance that they're comparing very, very well with grass plus 270. How does that pattern of growth play out through the growing season? We're thinking about trying to bridge some of those gaps that Tara was outlined for future projections of grass growth. Similar, well, the graph itself, the grass plus 270 is the solid red line. The 2 dashed lines are the clover plots, okay? So in the spring, as you can see, March and April, very little difference in terms of growth rate. Some separation happening in the early part of the season, and the grass plus 67, the green dashed line, the grass plus 67 is keeping up with the grass only plus 270. Middle part of the season, they're all quite similar. The big game changer is in the later part of the summer. And you saw it, any of you who have any white clover, it was really bursting through the sward very successfully in the later part of the summer. And that could be a sward adaptation measure as well. And if we can produce that extra herbage when grass isn't growing so well, and push that supply into the autumn, it helps to address producing more grass into the autumn. And just out of interest there, the clover content, for those who are interested, the May percentage of clover in those same plots was about 10 or 11%, rising up to about 40%. So when people talk about how much clover have you got in your sward, depends when you measure it, averaging over the season about 25. So in terms of an adaptation measure, yes, it's got all the attributes, and especially that much more productive spell going into late summer. The graze grow model that Tara was talking about and that Scott created back a number of years ago, that now has to be re-looked at and rebuilt. There was an early version of a prediction model for grass clover, and that has to be brought back up into play and facilitate those who are keen to use grass white clover in the industry. And just a caution note at the bottom, that nitrogen fixation, which is what draws down the nitrogen and delivers it to the grass, okay, that is happening as a spoon-feeding exercise right throughout the growing season. When the temperature's right, the nitrogen fixation happens, and you get that trickling effect of nitrogen feeding through into the grass. And that is what drives the whole system. What drives the adaptation? These are the questions that pop up into mind. And I think it's all about the stolons. And you have to get down on your hands and knees in the sward to discover what's going on. And wait until you've cut the field or maybe grazed it very close. The top photograph there, you can see the close grazing. The bottom photograph, what I'm trying to highlight is the wiry stolons that are at the very base of the sward. They are the clover survival mechanism. Okay? They will help the clover survive spring through to autumn and into the following year. So maybe we as farmers, as advisors and researchers, will have to kind of relearn how do we even assess the persistency, the survivability of a good grass clover sward in the first place. We're not just talking about white clover. We have a red clover project. AgResearch and AFBI working together with a number of partner farmers, some of you are in the audience today, and basically trying to evaluate establishment and management and productivity of red clover swards. Not to say too much about it, but essentially some of the early figures coming through there are very good in terms of the comparability. There's a grass sward in each farm and a red clover sward on each farm when we're comparing the numbers, and they're looking very favourable so far. From an adaptation point of view, it's all about the roots. That's an 8-inch spade. The roots are going down 4, 5, 6 inches. So that's where the sward adaptation is happening. It's influencing the soil, influencing the permeability of the soil at the same time. Top middle photograph is a grass-only sward, limited rooting depth. Middle photograph in the centre shows you that the soil type is still quite blocky and dense, hard to break up. The bottom of the 3 photographs is underneath a red clover sward, where you have a much more friable, much more open, more free-draining type soil, mainly due to the rooting. Okay? And just a cautionary note on the right-hand side, there's a lot of varieties of red clover out there. We have to be very careful when we're judging which red clover variety to plant, and that's for the here and now. We were down at the Chuggas Moor Park trial. Photograph in the bottom right of the slide shows there were 2 varieties out of about 12 are the only 2 that you would consider planting. And we also need to look further forward when we're thinking about sward adaptation right through into the somewhere near to 2100. The Czechoslovakian trial with the photograph in the very bottom right-hand side showed the reasoning behind poor persistency of some varieties was stem rot in the red clover varieties. A DARE-funded trial that we're just getting up towards the end of after 2 years of grazing. Could we just add in 1 extra species into a traditional grass-based sward? In this case, what we call the high plantain sward, 2.5 kilos of plantain added in with the ryegrass. That's what a high plantain sward looks like. And the dairy cow performance has all been good and safe. The point I want to make from an adaptation point of view, if you look at the centre part of the bar chart, that shows the high plantain proportions of grass to plantain throughout the summer months. And you can see there as the grass, the green bars are the grass, the purple bars are the plantain. As the grass peaks and then falls through the growing season, the purple bars, the plantain, fill in the gaps. So it's a wonderful example, a really nice example of species complementarity. And when one breathes out, one breathes in. In terms of adaptation, there's a suggestion in what we saw last year where we married the grass growth rates of the plantain sward, which is the purple line, versus the grass-only sward, the green line. Looking at the rainfall bars across the bottom of the chart as you go through the whole grazing season, there was a suggestion, at least only 1 year, suggestion that there was extra growth on the plantain swards in the spring months there, and again in the autumn, for quite different weather conditions. We all remember how wet it was back last autumn. So there's some advantages there to be harnessed as well from an adaptation point of view. Over-yielding also occurs. I'll speed up, Ian. That just shows you how different species coming together gives you an additive effect. If the sum of the parts is greater than the sum of the components, or however that phrase goes. And also there's that benefit beneath the surface with the deeper rooting. We found under multi-species swards at grazing trials at Hillsborough, higher populations of deep burrowing earthworms excuse me, beneath the surface, which was good for soil health. The last option for sward adaptation is, can we integrate grassland and trees? Which, as I say, to some people is a controversial step to even consider. Left-hand side photograph, what we're familiar with, grass and maybe some trees and hedges out at the edges. Far right-hand side, dense woodland. Very limited opportunities for grazing at the base. The sweet spot in the middle is what we call silvopasture or agroforestry. And there's been, again, another long-term study done down at AFBI Gall, where they've looked at agroforestry since about 1987, 88. The silvopasture there, much lower density, but you can see there's a grazable sward at the base of that. No, it's not as high a yielding sward as you'd get out in the open field, but there's a compromise here. You're getting the wood crop as well. But for extended grazing, thinking back to adaptation measures, what they did was they looked at the soil moisture content. In the dark blue line is the grass-only field. The light blue line, which is very faint, the light blue line is the agroforestry field. The dashed line going across is 40% soil moisture. Above 40%, there's the risk of damage through poaching or cutting up or compaction. And you can see there for the agroforestry field, right through from September to May, the grass-only field was above 40% in that particular winter for most of that period, whereas the agroforestry, with the extra value of the rooting and the porosity and the drainage capacity of that sward, the agroforestry was only at the 40% critical period for a relatively short time. So there's increased extended grazing potential to harness the grass supply that Tara was suggesting, through increased trafficability at the surface. So how, Ian, if you just spare me another few minutes, how do we bring all this together? You've heard a lot. There's been a whistle-stop tour of a range of different types of sward interventions and adaptations and adjusting fertilizer rates, all of that. How do we put it into practice? So this is just a fairly standard LIPIS map, a single farm payment map. It is a real farm, and there's at least two people in the audience will recognise the farm straight away. But essentially all of the fields belonging to that farm are marked in green, just to emphasise that the default option has been either to work with the existing permanent pasture or to reseed with a ryegrass type sward. You can also see that there's some areas of existing woodland, and there's a small lake, and there's water courses running to it. So it's got all the types of mixture of features that you would have in a typical Northern Ireland farm. But I think what we have to do, first of all, before we start thinking, all right, I'll jump for red clover, I'll do multi-species, you have to sort of categorise each of your fields on your farm. We talked a lot about variability all day, but you've also got a lot of variability in your farm, field to field to field. So I've just categorised them here. You have the green ones near to the farmyard, which could be your core grazing areas. The light, or the pink coloured ones are your outlying fields, which are usually mostly for silage, maybe some grazing. The red fields are the very drought prone. Maybe they're high, they're sloping, they're very well drained. So there's a contrast in all these different field types and the uses for these fields. So what can we do? Take the adaptations that we were talking about earlier. What can we apply to different conditions around one farm? Core grazing area near the yard, you need carrying capacity. You need early and late season growth. It could still be based around perennial ryegrass and clover and plantain perhaps, but also could one or two of those fields be switched over to an Italian hybrid type mixture to harness that extra productivity that we're going to get in the early spring. And the silage in the outlying fields could be switched over from grass only, slurry and nitrogen, to a forage legume such as red clover. Maybe marry that in with the hybrid ryegrass for the benefits that you also saw earlier. The wet, heavy fields that were lying down close to that lake on the farm a minute ago, sitting most of the year at the water table. You need deep rooting. You need plants that are low pH tolerant and waterlogging tolerant. Festuloleum. Festuloleum has more air-filled pockets in the root cellular tissue. It can survive waterlogging for longer. John, that's maybe one to think about. And Timothy as well. Timothy's not deep rooting, but it has a tolerance of moisture at the surface and it's fairly early growing as well. And there's even legumes that can tolerate those type of conditions. Lotus or bird's foot trefoil, as you might know it. Dry, drought-prone fields, it's the fescue family. So I'm not saying that it's goodbye to ryegrass, but you need to consider all of these other species in particular niches around a farm. I'll move on. Beside an existing copse of trees, maybe that's your natural place to create a wildlife corridor and all of that, but also to deploy agroforestry. And we talked earlier about it being more trafficable and lower moisture content at the surface and less risky. We need to get the right species in at the base of the trees at the same time. So it's the shade-tolerant fescues, the subterranean clovers, species like that. We just have to be imaginative in some of these adaptation measures. Steep slopes near the waterways. This is a photograph here of two hills, two drumlins right on the Hillsborough estate. There's an open drain running right down the middle. So it's a natural floodline, and then that feeds into the Hillsborough Lake. So there is a good example of strategic use of trees. The willow and the alder can be planted there to kind of filter the nutrients before they get to the waterway. And those less productive areas, we all have them, little dots around the farm. Maybe those are the natural places to encourage biodiversity, native woodland, wildflowers, wetland species. So to sum up, I think we've seen all the challenges that Tara was outlined. We need, if we're trying to future-proof our farms, we need to seriously consider more agile management. And it's not just about fertilizer, but that's a part of it. And we also need to develop, understand, and deploy some of these grassland adaptations that I've just been talking about, ultimately to provide tailored sward solutions for our farms in Northern Ireland going forward. That's this.